They had a diagram, sort of like a drawing of a being with his ribs open, and it's just showing a very simple digestive system. Another autopsy report talked about the head, especially the eyes, which I thought was interesting because they showed that there was these black lenses that when you take them out, completely changed how they look. Another autopsy report that showed that the brain was a little different, like we have right hemisphere and left hemisphere. They appear to have two and then another hemisphere, which makes their head a little different shape. They're bigger than ours.
Extraordinary claims being presented by a man that no one has heard of. David Armstrong was a vendor at the 2014 IUFOC selling his music and claims that he saw files relating to UFO reports at McClellan Air Force Base in the early 70s. McClellan Air Force Base is a former United States Air Force base located in the North Highlands area of Sacramento County, 7 miles northeast of Sacramento, California. For the vast majority of its operational lifetime, McClellan was a logistics and maintenance facility for a wide variety of military aircraft, equipment, and supplies, primarily under the cognizance of the Air Force Logistics Command, or AFLC, and later the Air Force Materiel Command, or AFMC. Coast Guard Air Station Sacramento continues to operate at McClellan following its closure in 1995 as an Air Force base. It is the only remaining military aviation unit and installation on the airfield. Armstrong claims that an impromptu visit to McClellan allowed him a short opportunity to view files that were classified as top secret.
I had an aunt that worked at McClellan Air Force Base in the UFO Records Library. And she had a pretty high civilian clearance, like a GS-12 or something like that, which means government service, and then there's a digit or a number after that. And she had worked there, I think, for about 18 years, and I got out one time to see her in my 20s, and she'd asked me if I'd wanted to go get a tour of the McClellan Air Force Base. And all I knew about her job is that it was kind of a, top secret kind of position, and she said she wanted to first take me to her office and then show me around the base a little bit. So we first went to the building at McClellan Air Force Base that she had her office, and we had to go to the desk and get our badges or whatever we wear when you're on the base so they know you belong there. And the secretary buzzed her colonel, I think it was, who came out. She introduced me to the colonel, and then she took me into the office. And the office was locked up like Fort Knox. I mean, it had these 9-digit, push button things that you got to go in order to get the door open. And it was like a 4-digit code. I think she pushed 4 buttons, and then the door opens up. And we walked in down the hallways, and then there was another door identical to that. You had to do it again to get into her office. But once you were in the office, it was just like a small hotel room with a bunch of files and a desk in the middle of the room. And she said, well, this is where I spend all my time categorizing, it's like the genealogy, but it's of extraterrestrial UFOs, sightings, and all that kind of stuff. And the door pops open to the right of the desk there, and the same colonel comes walking out and says, Joanne, I know this is your day off, and it's your time with your nephew, but something has just come up and it's rather urgent, so if we could have 45 minutes, an hour of your time, we can get this wrapped up and you can be on your way. And she said, sure. But my nephew's here, he's visiting from North Dakota, and it's really hot outside. I can't really leave him in the car. Is it okay if he sits in my office and reads a book or something? And he said, sure. So I went back in the office where she was, and she reached down the second drawer of her desk on the right-hand side and pulled the drawer open, and there was a book. And she hands me this book to read. And then she told me as she was leaving, don't touch anything, and she kind of winked at me. So I didn't know if that was giving me the go-ahead or what, but she said not to touch anything. And the thing is, I could hear her walking down the hall, and the other door open and there's a lot of noise, clank, and the door shuts. So I thought, well, I'll have time if I did have a file open and when they come back. So I'm going to start right away. I turn around, I start looking at different files and they're labeled. This one was labeled crash retrievals, and so I started opening from the top drawer down. Just a 4-drawer file. They weren't locked. And the first drawer had, you know, it looks like it started with alphabet A and whatever, and a whole lot of files in there. And I pulled another one out, and there were a lot of files in that, and I closed it, and I looked at another file, and the third one, I went down to the 4th file, and there wasn't a whole lot in that file. So I shut that drawer and went back to the 3rd, and there was a file there that was labeled, you know, I guess it was Pennsylvania crash site or whatever. So I pulled that one out first and I laid it on the desk and just reviewing, and it looked like you know, like a saucer of some sort had crashed in the Pennsylvania area, and I just started flipping through it, and there were a couple of photos, and so I assumed this was somewhere, you know, in the 70s at some time or whatever, but I don't remember too well. I put the file back in the drawer, and then there was one that said Patterson Wright, and opened that file, started paging through some of them, and it looked like there was pictures of an airplane hangar, you know, like this was a place where something was stored, you know, and it was talking all these memos, interdepartment memos. A lot of them were stopped or stamped with secret or, you know, top secret or some sort of stamp, black and white. And one of the letters I remember, though, had information about, you know, as soon as this gets processed, and it looked like it come from, you know, a lab that was going to analyze one of these crafts. That said it would take 4 to 6 months to have a full report, you know, and blah, 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 and, you know, it's some sort of message. Well, then I closed that file, put it back in. Then I saw one labeled Roswell Corona, and I'd kind of heard of that, so I pulled that out and started looking, and in there were some Polaroid pictures. And when I saw these Polaroids, I thought, oh, well, first I'm going to look at those, and they had rubber bands wrapped twice around them or whatever. I opened up the Band-Aids, or the rubber bands that were around them, and one of the first photos was a tall general standing next to a very short-looking alien being, which I would call the Gray. It had a sort of a large head, a real kind of skinny body, like 4.5 feet tall, rather large black eyes, you know, kind of scary looking. And at the time, I'd never seen anything like that. So I stared at that for a little while, and then I put that picture down and put up another picture, and there were 4 bodies laying on a tarp. Just their heads were exposed, and you could see these beings were dead. And one of the faces was all smashed on one side on one of the beings, so I knew they must have come to some, you know, hell of a collision or something. Then another file showed a picture of a saucer, but it had like a big gaping hole in the front of it. And I could see inside the photo there was like a couple seats, but I couldn't make out too much of the detail in the seats. When I was looking at it, you could see that the terrain in the outside was like a sort of a rocky desert kind of area, sparsely vegetated, you know. And so I didn't know too much about that case at that time. I just saw, okay, well, there was a crash retrieval. And some other files, pictures that just showed, you know, one was a picture of this Army truck and a trailer behind it. So I take it that's when they loaded this craft on kind of a lowboy trailer. This really old truck too. I'd have to say, guessing from the photos, it was of the probably fairly new of the time period, because later I found out this happened in July of 1947. And the Army truck had a kind of a tarp over the side. It was rounded and went a little bit higher than the cab. So I assumed that that's what they were cleaning up the debris on. On the front of the trailer was this giant box, looked like a bunch of cables strung over the top so it wouldn't shift or whatever. And then I saw how the other ones were wrapped with a rubber band, so I thought I'd put them back exactly the same way so she couldn't tell I'd been in there. And then opened the second package. And this had another craft, but it didn't have much left of it, and it's just a lot of debris, it looked like they were picturing. And from a distance you could see the debris looked like it spread a long ways. And then there was a picture of a guy holding some aluminum foil of some sort, and then there was a picture of 5 beings laying on a tarp. So I figured, well, this is the second crash. And first one, it looked like it had 4 with 1 living, and this one looked like it had 5 all dead. And then wrapped that pile up, and I opened up the third pile. And this one seemed to be a craft, but it was pretty nice shape, like, still like a big burn hole on the side, but not significant. And in this picture they showed 5 beings, but it was a different colored tarp that it was laying on, so you could see it was a kind of a different location from the background, it looked like. So there were different pictures. In this one they had a picture of a little close-up. It looked like something had burned into it, sort of right up at the top. And then I saw photos of 3 guys standing in military costume in front of the craft. So it looked like the craft was taller than a 6-foot human, maybe by a foot or 2, and then it appeared to be about 40 or 50 feet across, so not really small craft, but not real huge either. And these things were saucer shaped, they were. And then there were some pictures of some different vehicles in the area that must have been used to clean up the craft. And in one of the photos you could see there were a number of guys with, looked like gas masks and stuff they were wearing. So I wrapped that file up and I started to look at some of the paperwork that I saw in there. And there was some that were labeled, just a report, and some that showed an autopsy written up typewritten sheet. They had like a diagram, sort of like a drawing of a being with his ribs open, and it's just showing a very simple digestive system, like a tube. And in there, on the bottom of the sheet I was reading, it said they found in that tube, they found the same material that they found in the console of the chair. It looked like a little flat wafer about that big around, like a quarter. And they said they were thin, and they think that was what they were eating or using for their food, but it didn't look like they required a lot of sustenance like humans do. They said that they believed that these beings were, very similar in build nature to each other, almost like clones, so there wasn't a whole lot of differences. Another autopsy report talked about the head, especially the eyes, which I thought was interesting because they showed that there was these black lenses that when you take them out, completely changed how they look. So they were like eye inserts or whatever. And they said when you look through them, you could see at night better. So it looked like something they were wearing because maybe the bright lights bothered them or whatever. But the gist of the article there was the eye inserts must have been because they come from a darker area and they weren't used to our sunlight or something, that they needed this to fly and operate with. And they appeared to be like a plastic of unknown origin, it said. So it was really hard, and you couldn't scratch it, the report said, and it appeared to be, artificially created, and the mouth was pretty small. It didn't look like they had much for chewing. Like, they wouldn't be able to eat meat or anything like that, so if anything, they had to have been vegetarian. Didn't have much for ears, and another diagram was showing that a diagram with a human ear, and then underneath it, you know, they had a simpler ear almost than humans have, but somewhat similar in, you know, in some ways. But I was flipping through these things pretty fast, and there was another autopsy report that showed that the brain was a little different. Like, we have right hemisphere and left hemisphere. They appear to have two and then another hemisphere, which makes their head a little different shaped. They're bigger than ours. So it had three hemispheres instead of two. But they said that the matter in the brain looked a lot like the human brain is darker than what their brain was. It was lighter color, lighter in nature. Another report was showing their fingers. There were 4 fingers, and they were almost the same length, but they were a lot more flexible than a human hand, it said. And they all appear to be like they'd function as a thumb. So, like, these beings had fairly dexterous fingers, you know, what the article was suggesting, as opposed to 5 digits that a human has. So it was talking about the difference, you know, and very thin. I mean, there wasn't much. They said one of the beings had just a slightly protruded belly, but you know, but not very large. Like in humans, they're all different shapes and sizes, and these were almost clones of each other. You know. So anyway, after I looked through the pictures, these appear to be Polaroids of some sort, and I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know when the Polaroid came out, so years later I was reading online about the Polaroid land camera came out in 1948, and this happened in 1947. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, because these really look like Polaroids to me, you know, because I know when I was a kid and I first saw the first one, I would say that's what those photographs looked like, except these looked really old and yellowed, you know, there wasn't much color left in them. And when I started reading further on the internet about the land camera, it said that they believed that the military had a more advanced version of the type they sold to the homes that came out several years in advance from the Polaroid. Now it's kind of adding up that there would be, they had that technology back there to take pictures on the spot, that type of thing. So they're probably using their new technology, you know. And then some of the files talked about where they believed they were from, but appeared to be written at a much later date, you know, like, you know, 7, 8 years later.
So it looks like somebody went back in and re-reviewed the files and amended things, or
added pages to the file after, you know, more testing and completion was done. Mm-hmm. And they showed an area of Zeta Reticuli, and it had like an S and then 2 numbers after it. I just don't remember what they called the planet that supposedly he pointed out they were from. Another diagram showed that they show 6 of these, and they're calling them podcrafts now, which means that there's a bigger ship somewhere that doesn't come down to Earth, and then these little scout units would go out.
Was that written in the report?
Yeah, it was written. I don't remember just how it was written, but I remember the gist of it. And it made it sound like they were on a archaeology mission. Oh, and one of the photographs I remember had this like a black box that they took a picture of, and I thought that was kind of funny, but they were showing the box, and in there was a couple of rocks and like a plant, like a cactus, which now when I read this other report makes sense, because it appears that they were collecting samples, and they maybe put them in a box, and then when the craft come apart, here this box was, and it shows their samples. So I don't think they're here with any weapon. It showed no sign of any weaponry or anything like that. It was just a mission of exploration, you know, that the report seemed to suggest. Then I read a report about communication with the being that was living. Apparently this one being lived about 2 years. And they had a number of people try to communicate with them, but they started working more in diagrams, pictures, and then eventually got to the point where where somebody was able to be more telepathic with the individual, and that he gave them information that couldn't be substantiated, but it was likely that the person that was telepathic was doing his best to tell the truth, it said. So they believed that the being would never be, rescued, or was assumed all to be dead. And in the report it said that this being was at first transferred to Albuquerque with a special doctor flown in to, view at a hospital facility there in Albuquerque, because he appeared to be really weak, and that the rest of them had disintegrated to the point where they had to wear gas masks to even get close to the craft. It was so disgusting. And this being, they offered him water and he did take it, but he wouldn't. They tried to give him something to eat and he wouldn't eat anything, so they knew that he needed medical assistance. So I suppose they had to bring in a special doctor on account of the fact that they wanted to keep this pretty much under wraps. I must have been there a couple of hours before I heard the sound of a door, and then I had to put away what I was looking at. But at the time when I heard the door, I was actually just opening a file, so it wasn't much to that. But there was, files labeled different things. One was, labeled sightings, and in that file there was, listed by country even. So apparently a lot of countries were participating in this program, and I believe that my aunt got the information and typed up her own report, and in those files there would be letters and stuff from generals that she did not type up, that was just stuck in there. But she did tell me that the reason she had to keep such an organized filing room is that if anybody ever needed to view a file, they needed to know right now where to get it, and so she kept everything in order, and that was her job. As soon as she walked in, I was sitting down on her desk, and I opened it up to page 50, and I read a paragraph or two or whatever in the book, like I was deep into the book or something, just and I never admitted to her that I went into the files.
So you and her never had a conversation about it?
Well, when we were driving away, she said to me, "You didn't look anything, did you?" And I said no. I said I was, reading the book the whole time, and she'd asked me, "Well, did you enjoy the book?" And I said, "Yeah, I was up to page such and such, and I was reading about this part because I remember the paragraph or two I read." And she goes, "Oh, I know where you're at," because apparently she'd already read the book. But I sort of disregarded the information because I was in my 20s and not interested in this stuff, and it really didn't even come to my attention until I went to my first UFO conference in Laughlin, Nevada, and that probably been about 10 years ago. And Jim Mars was the speaker at the time, and he was talking about the controversy, the cover-up at Roswell, and I just thought to myself, well, that's really amusing to me, because I didn't realize there had been a cover-up. Nobody told me that all this was going on behind the scenes. I just knew what I saw, and I never paid any attention to the UFO world at all. So when I got through with the conference, there was a fellow that was a director of it. His name was Bob Brown, and I'd walked up to him and I said, "I don't know what all the controversy about Roswell, whether it happened or not." I said, because I've actually seen the file that the military has, and I said that you could see it was a real case, or they wouldn't be holding on to it and guarding it, And he said, "Well, how did you get in there?" And I said, "Well, my aunt worked there, and I was there."
So you told him the story.
Yeah, so I told basically a nutshell, and he asked me if if she's still alive, and I said yes, and I said, would she be willing to do an interview? And I said, well, I could certainly ask her, but when we were riding in the car that time when I had explained to her that, you know, that I hadn't looked at anything, and she told me, she said, if you did ever say anything about where I worked, you know, they would kill my family, and, you know, her as well. And I said, are you serious? You know, just for, you know, mentioning that? Oh, I never did, because there wasn't any point in, you know, mentioning it, and nobody ever brought it up. It just out of sight, out of mind. But I called her to ask if she'd be interested in speaking to some UFO researchers about the topic. They're trying to get to the bottom of the UFO controversy and the cover-up in Roswell and that kind of stuff. And she said, oh no, they'd kill my family. And it was, she'd been retired for some years. And I didn't, you know, I didn't really believe that. And I thought, well, if she was one of the younger ones working there, I think by now all the people that were her superiors would be long dead. You know, last week, and I asked her if she wanted to talk any about her position at McClellan Air Force Base and give me more information before she were to pass on. And she said, well, I'm not going anywhere. I've got a vitamin business at home, and, you know, I got to get back. I'm just here for a little while. Well, apparently she was not accepting the fate of her mortality or anything like that, and she was going to take this information to her grave. Yeah, there was some things I was surprised that I could remember. I mean, I kind of remember, you know, the details driving over there and everything, and which I hadn't really thought of. And I remember that one of the pictures of an I-beam had some symbols, and she did actually a post-hypnotic suggestion where that's, you know, sometime during the next week you'll be able to draw these symbols. And I just kind of remember the top one, and there were like 4 in a row or something stacked on each other down the I-beam. But she thought it'd be interesting to see if we could draw it out and have remembrance there. But just remembering that there were these scribbles on the I-beam or whatever was kind of surprising, that I could visualize them a little bit. And then seeing some of the memos that I could see myself turning the pages, looking at the next one, and oh, that's another autopsy thing, and this is, so I was surprised that there was some more clarity, I think. There was a file that was labeled Altarians, and it was spelled A-L-T-A-R-I-A-N-S, and they're from a planet called Altar that matched the description of what everybody calls the tall whites, so I just assumed they were the same thing. And one of the UFO researchers, you know, that I had sent an email to here a couple of months ago, did some investigating, and he found a star called Altarians, and he said that the fellow that wrote the book on and named the tall whites was named Charles Hall, and that Charles had said that they never told him where they were from. And in his documentation, he just called them the tall whites. But according to what, you know, this fellow found, he believes this to be, you know, a match. My perspective of aliens, I always believed there was such a thing. Even as a child, I believed that, you know, we're not alone in this universe. Thousands of people have actually, you know, been eyewitnesses to either the crash cleanups and that kind of stuff, and their stories have been heard. But I think because the government wants to keep it shush-shush, even I don't know if there's threats or a pile of money involved or something, but it seems like disclosure is just starting to happen more and more so. And I see more people willing to come out and talk. It doesn't matter to me, you know, what kind of opinion anybody has of my experience. It was just that, you know, I was there, I saw it. It's no big deal to me. Years ago, I might have had in the back of my mind, I don't want to get my aunt in trouble, and for that reason probably kept it quiet. She died not that long ago, but even her own 2 of her living children, the youngest one knew a little bit about it, but he's passed on now, and the older 2 are still alive. But They indicated that they knew their mother worked in a very top secret department but didn't know what she did. My aunt had said one time to me that she really believed that what she was doing was important, and that it was even more important that it never got leaked to the public what she was doing.